My name is Beatrice Caldwell, and if you're listening to this old woman's tale, then perhaps there's still hope in this world for kindness." She paused, wiping her eyes with a handkerchief that had seen better days. "I wasn't always this broken. Creature you see before you. Once I was young, full of dreams, married to the most wonderful man God ever created." Her fingers traced the edges of the photograph, a young couple standing beside a modest farmhouse, both beaming with the kind of joy that seems invincible. That was Harold and me on our wedding day 62 years ago. Look at us. We thought we had forever. Her voice broke completely now, shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. If you found comfort in stories of human resilience, please consider supporting this channel by clicking that subscribe button. Your kindness means everything to an old soul like me. Harold had been everything to Beatrice's husband, best friend, protector, and provider. They built their life together on a small farm outside the town of Millbrook, raising chickens, growing vegetables, and dreaming of the children they'd have someday. But children never came. Beatrice continued, her voice now steady with the practiced pain of old grief. 45 years we tried, we prayed, we hoped. Every month brought disappointment. Every doctor's visit brought more bad news. The other wives in town would cross the street when they saw me coming, afraid my barrenness might be catching. She laughed bitterly, a sound devoid of any humor. Harold never blamed me, never made me feel less than whole, but I blamed myself every single day. I watched him play with the neighbor children and saw the longing in his eyes. I knew I was failing him as a wife, as a woman. The real tragedy began 15 years ago on a Tuesday that started like any other. Harold had gone to town to buy supplies for the farm, something he'd done 1,000 times before, but this time he never came home. The sheriff knocked on /M. I'll start knocked on /M. Then, we all know, I've been exploring that. And we all know I've been exploring that path. Harold had gone to town to buy supplies. For supplies. As we buy supplies by Sequar applies with supplies. Be while secanding with sublig, saweed, seresk, Kai to see if we salaf Secor I san I'm reneved to be sediacta kai call I to we sakai I so we akadui we kisai get to I disakik sashai sisek I to decay ekakai to kikai kai to kak I conk have you I took I was to regret at the can you cover it I could have my door at 6:30 that evening, Beatrice recalled fresh tears streaming down her face. I knew before he even spoke. I knew my world was about to end. Harold's truck had been hit by a drunk driver at the intersection of Main and Elm. He died instantly. They said as if that was supposed to bring comfort. The drunk driver walked away without a scratch. 65 years old, my Harold was. We were planning to travel to see the ocean together for the first time. We had brochures spread across the kitchen table. Myrtle Beach, Virginia Beach, places we'd only dreamed about. Her voice rose in anguish. Instead, I planned his funeral. The funeral was small. Most of their friends had already passed away, and they'd never had children to mourn with her. Beatrice stood alone beside the grave, watching them lower the only person who'd ever truly loved her into the cold, unforgiving ground. I thought about joining him that day, she admitted, her confession hanging heavy in the air. Standing there in my black dress, the only black dress I owned because I'd never expected to need one. I thought about how easy it would be to just ... story but death, it seemed, wasn't finished with Beatrice yet. Within 6 months of Harold's passing, she received a letter that would destroy what little remained of her world. The bank. She spat, anger flashing in her tired eyes. 47 years we'd banked with Millbrook Savings, never missed a payment, never caused trouble. But Harold had signed some papers guaranteed a loan for his nephew's business venture. They said, when the business failed, they came for our farm. Beatrice's hands shook as she remembered the day they came to evict her. 3 men in expensive suits flanked by a sheriff's deputy, standing on the porch Harold had built with his own hands. I begged them, she whispered, shame coloring her words. A woman of 71 years old, begging strangers not to take the only home I'd ever known. They wouldn't even look me in the eye. With nowhere else to go and no family to turn to, Beatrice was forced into Sunset Manor, a state-run nursing home with a reputation that matched its government funding, which is to say, barely adequate and often cruel. If these stories of struggle and survival touch your heart, I'd be grateful if you'd join our community by subscribing sometimes. Knowing that someone cares is all that keeps an old heart beating. Sunset Manor was everything Beatrice had feared and worse. The building reeked of disinfectant and despair, with understaffed halls echoing with the moans and cries of forgotten elderly residents. My room was 6 feet by 8 feet. Beatrice described, her voice hollow with remembered horror. A bed, a chair, and a small dresser. One window that looked out onto the parking lot where family members came to visit everyone except me. The staff at Sunset Manor treated the residents like burdens rather than human beings. Meals were often cold and tasteless. Medications were distributed with impatience. And complaints were met with threats of behavioral medications that would leave residents docile and silent. They called me Bed 7. Beatrice said, fresh tears flowing. Not Mrs. Caldwell, not Beatrice, just Bed 7, as if I wasn't even human anymore, just a number on their charts. The worst part wasn't the institutional food or the indifferent staff. It was the loneliness. Day after day, Beatrice would sit in the common room, watching other residents receive visits from children and grandchildren while she remained utterly alone. I'd watch Martha get flowers from her daughter every Sunday, and Florence would light up whenever her grandson called. But my phone never rang. My mailbox stayed empty, and no one ever asked the woman in Bed 7 how she was feeling. The breaking point came on a cold February morning, almost 3 years into her stay at Sunset Manor. Beatrice had developed a severe chest infection, but the weekend nursing staff dismissed her complaints as attention-seeking behavior. I couldn't breathe. She gasped, the memory still vivid and terrifying. I was burning with fever, coughing up blood, begging for help. The night nurse, a cruel woman named Janet, told me to stop being dramatic and gave me a cough drop. By Monday morning, Beatrice was delirious with fever and struggling to remain conscious. It was only when the day shift supervisor found her unresponsive that they finally called an ambulance. I spent 2 weeks in the hospital with pneumonia, Beatrice continued. 2 weeks where I was treated like a human being. Again, where nurses called me by my name and doctors actually listened to my symptoms. I didn't want to go back to that place, but where else could I go? The hospital's social worker, a kind woman named Patricia, tried to find alternatives. But Beatrice's limited Social Security benefits meant Sunset Manor was her only option. I remember lying in that hospital bed, looking up at the ceiling tiles, and finally asking God why he was keeping me alive just to suffer, Beatrice whispered. What was the point of continuing when every day brought nothing but pain and loneliness? It was during her recovery at the hospital that something extraordinary happened, something that would change the trajectory of Beatrice's remaining years in ways she never could have imagined. The nurse brought me a letter, Beatrice said, her voice taking on a different quality, still sad but touched with something else. I thought it was a medical bill or some form I needed to sign. But the return address said Peterson and Associates, attorneys at law. With trembling fingers. Beatrice had opened the letter that would alter her destiny. The law firm was writing to inform her that she was the beneficiary of an estate belonging to one Margaret Elizabeth Henley, a name Beatrice didn't recognize. I read that letter 5 times before it sank in, she recalled, wonder creeping into her voice. This Margaret Henley had left me her entire estate, a house, money, everything. But who was she? Why would a stranger leave anything to me? The mystery deepened when the attorney, Mr. Peterson, visited Beatrice in the hospital. He explained that Margaret Henley had been a wealthy widow who had lived quietly in the neighboring town of Oakville. She had no family, no close friends, and had spent her final years researching genealogy. Mr. Peterson showed me the family tree Margaret had constructed, Beatrice explained. Turns out she was my second cousin, my grandmother's sister's granddaughter. We'd never met, never even knew the other existed, but she'd found me through her research. Margaret had learned about Beatrice's situation through her investigations into their shared family history. She'd discovered Harold's obituary, traced Beatrice to Sunset Manor, and had been quietly observing from afar, planning her final act. Of kindness. The house was beautiful, Beatrice said, her voice filled with an emotion she hadn't felt in years. Gratitude. A Victorian cottage with a wraparound porch, flower gardens, and a white picket fence was like something from a fairy tale. Margaret's house sat on 2 acres of land in a quiet neighborhood where families still looked out for one another. The interior was furnished with antiques and family heirlooms, each piece carefully maintained and loved. But the most incredible thing was the letter Margaret had left for me. Beatrice continued, reaching into her pocket and pulling out a carefully folded piece of paper. She'd written it just weeks before she passed away. The letter read, "Dear Cousin Beatrice, though we never met in this life, I feel I know you through our shared blood and your husband Harold's beautiful obituary, which spoke of your kindness and devotion. I have watched from afar as life has tested you beyond what anyone should endure. You have suffered alone, and that breaks my heart. This house has been lonely since my Henry passed, and it needs someone who understands both sorrow and love to fill it with life again. Please accept this gift not as charity, but as family caring for family. Use these remaining years to find some peace, some joy, some purpose. You are not forgotten. You are loved. Your cousin, Margaret." I cried for 3 days after reading that letter, Beatrice admitted. Not tears of sadness, but tears of relief, of gratitude, of feeling human again. Moving into Margaret's house felt like awakening from a nightmare. Beatrice had her own bedroom with a 4-poster bed, a kitchen where she could cook real meals, and a garden where she could grow flowers and vegetables like she and Harold used to do. But the house was just the beginning, Beatrice said, her voice growing stronger. Margaret had left detailed journals about her own life, how she'd overcome loneliness after her husband died, how she'd found ways to help others even when she felt forgotten herself. Inspired by Margaret's example, Beatrice began to venture out into her new community. She discovered that Oakville had a senior center that provided meals and companionship for elderly residents who were struggling with isolation. At first, I just went for the company, Beatrice admitted. But then I started noticing other women, like me, widows who had lost everything, who had no family, who felt invisible to the world. Beatrice began volunteering at the senior center, helping to prepare meals and organize activities. But more importantly, she began to listen, really listen to the stories of other elderly people who felt forgotten by society. There was Dorothy, whose children had moved across the country and never called. There was Agnes, who'd been evicted from her apartment and was living in her car. There was Ruth, who hadn't spoken to another human being in 3 weeks before she came to the center. I realized that my pain, my losses, my struggles, they weren't unique, Beatrice explained. There were dozens of us in that little town, all carrying similar burdens, all feeling alone in our grief. Asterisk Beatrice proposed starting a support group for widowed women over leaked to 5. The senior center director was skeptical at first, but agreed to let them meet once a week in a small conference room. Asterisk our first meeting. Only 3 women showed up, Beatrice remembered. But by the end of the month, we had 12 regular members. By the end of the year, we had 23. Asterisk the group, which they called the Sisterhood of Survivors, became a lifeline for women who had lost their way after losing their husbands. They shared meals, celebrated birthdays, attended funerals together, and most importantly, they listened to each other's stories without judgment. Asterisk we created something beautiful from our collective pain, Beatrice said, pride evident in her voice. We proved that even in our 70s and 80s, we still had value, still had love to give, still had wisdom to share. Asterisk, the success of the sisterhood led to other initiatives. Beatrice used part of Margaret's inheritance to start a small fund that helped elderly women who were facing eviction or couldn't afford medications. The group began visiting nursing homes, places like Sunset Manor, spend time with residents who never received visitors. Asterisk I went back to Sunset Manor, Beatrice revealed, her voice heavy with emotion. Not as a resident, but as a volunteer. I sat with the women who were now in bed 7 and the other beds around it. I held their hands, I listened to their stories, I made sure they knew their names mattered. Asterisk the staff at Sunset Manor initially treated Beatrice with suspicion, remembering her as a difficult former resident. But her persistence and kindness eventually won them over. And she was allowed to visit regularly. Asterisk I couldn't change the system, she acknowledged. But I could make individual days a little brighter for individual people. Sometimes that's enough. Asterisk the sisterhood's work caught the attention of local media, and Beatrice found herself being interviewed by newspapers and local television stations. Her story of loss and recovery inspired other communities to start similar support groups for isolated elderly residents. Asterisk people started calling me brave, Beatrice said with a slight smile. But I wasn't brave. I was just tired of being invisible, tired of watching other people suffer the way I had suffered. Asterisk if you've stayed with me this far in my story, please consider hitting that subscribe button and joining our community of people who believe in the dignity and worth of every human life regardless of age. Asterisk as Beatrice reflected on her journey from despair to purpose, she identified several crucial lessons that had emerged from her darkest hours. Asterisk first, I learned that grief never truly ends. It just changes shape, she said thoughtfully. I still miss Harold every single day. I still cry when I see elderly couples holding hands. But the grief no longer defines me completely. Asterisk, she had also discovered that meaningful connections could be found at any age, even after tremendous loss. I thought I was too old to make new friends, too broken to matter to anyone. But the women in our sisterhood became the sisters I never had, the family I thought I'd lost forever. Asterisk, perhaps most importantly, Beatrice learned that suffering could be transformed into service. My pain didn't disappear when I started helping others, she explained, but it found a purpose. Every woman I've sat with, every hand I've held, every story I've heard, it gives meaning to what I've endured. Asterisk, I'm 73 years old now, Beatrice said, straightening in her chair with dignity. If you'd told me 5 years ago that I'd be sitting here, telling my story to help others, I would have thought you were cruel to give me false hope. Asterisk, but Margaret's gift had provided more than just a house and financial security. It had given Beatrice the chance to rewrite the final chapters of her life. Instead of dying forgotten and alone in a nursing home, she had become a pillar of her community, a source of comfort for other struggling women, and an advocate for the elderly. Asterisk, the house is full of life now, she said with genuine joy. Members of this sisterhood come for Sunday dinners. We have book clubs and garden parties. We laugh together, cry together, and face whatever comes together. Asterisk Beatrice had also reconnected with some distant relatives through genealogy research, inspired By Margaret's example, she now exchanged letters with cousins she'd never known existed, and had even been visited by a great-niece who lived in California. Asterisk family isn't just about blood, she reflected. It's about who shows up, who cares, who chooses to love you, even when they don't have to. Asterisk, if there's someone listening to this old woman's tale who feels forgotten, who believes their best days are behind them, who can't imagine tomorrow being better than today, I want you to know something, Beatrice said, leaning forward with urgency. Asterisk, I want you to know that you matter. Your story matters. Your pain has not been for nothing, and your years of struggle have given you wisdom that the world desperately needs. Asterisk, she spoke directly to widows who were facing the crushing loneliness she remembered. So well, the love you shared doesn't die when they do. It transforms into something you can give to others who need it just as desperately as you once did. To those facing financial hardship and housing insecurity, I know the terror of not knowing where you'll sleep or how you'll eat. I know the shame of asking for help when you've always been the one giving it. But accepting help isn't defeat. It's survival, and survival is the first step toward helping others survive. Asterisk, to the elderly people listening who felt invisible to a youth-obsessed society, your experiences, your resilience, your capacity for love, these things don't diminish with age. They deepen. The world needs what you have to offer, even if it doesn't always recognize it. Asterisk, my story isn't over yet, Beatrice declared with determination. The sisterhood is planning to open a small community center where elderly women can come for meals, companionship, and practical support. We're working with local churches and businesses to create a network of care that ensures no woman in our community has to face crisis alone. Asterisk, she had also begun working with the state legislature on nursing home reform, sharing her experiences at Sunset Manor to advocate for better oversight and patient rights. I may not be able to save everyone, she admitted, but if I can spare even one person the treatment I received, then my suffering will have served a purpose. Asterisk, Beatrice's garden, inspired by Harold's memory, had become a source of both beauty and sustenance. She grew vegetables that she shared with food insecure seniors and flowers that brightened the tables at sisterhood gatherings. Asterisk, Harold would be proud of this garden, she said, looking out the window at rows of tomatoes and corn surrounded by marigolds and zinnias. He always said I had a gift for making things grow, even in difficult soil. Asterisk, as her story drew toward its close, Beatrice reflected on one of the most important lessons she'd learned: the transformative power of truly listening to another person's story. Asterisk, for 3 years at Sunset Manor, no one really listened to me, she remembered. They heard my complaints, they processed my requests, they noted my symptoms, but no one listened to my story, my fears, my dreams, my memories of better days. Asterisk, the sisterhood had taught her that every elderly person carried within them a lifetime of experiences, wisdom, love, and loss that deserved to be heard and honored. When I sit with Dorothy and she tells me about her late husband's terrible jokes, or when Agnes describes the garden she had to leave behind, I'm not just being polite, I'm witnessing their humanity. Asterisk, this deep listening had become Beatrice's greatest gift to others. And paradoxically, it had healed something in her own heart. When you truly listen to someone else's pain, your own pain becomes more bearable, she observed. Not because it's less real, but because you realize you're not alone in carrying it. Asterisk, I want to end my story where I began it, with gratitude, Beatrice said, her voice strong and clear despite her tears. Not gratitude for the suffering, because that would be dishonest, but gratitude for what the suffering taught me, for the people it led me to, for the purpose it revealed. Asterisk, she held up the photograph of Harold again, but this time her smile was peaceful rather than painful. I believe Harold can see what I've become, how I've used the love he gave me to love others. I believe Margaret is pleased that her house has become a gathering place for women who need community. I believe even my childless years served a purpose, They prepared me to mother dozens of women who needed someone to care about them. Asterisk looking directly ahead as if speaking to each listener individually. Beatrice concluded, life is long and much of it is hard. But it's also precious, and it's never too late to find meaning, to make connections, to matter to someone else's. Story, if an old woman like me can build a new life at 73, then anyone can find hope at any age. Asterisk, thank you for listening to my story. If it has touched your heart in any way, please subscribe to this channel and share these stories with others who might need to hear them. Sometimes knowing that someone else has walked through darkness and found light again is exactly what a struggling soul needs to take the next step forward. Asterisk, Beatrice set down the photograph and wiped her eyes one final time. The old wooden chair creaked as she rose, but her movements were steady and purposeful. She had work to do, people to see, love to give. The sun was setting outside her window, Margaret's window, but tomorrow would bring new opportunities to transform pain into purpose, isolation into community, and suffering into service. Asterisk, her story continued each day she chose to wake up and matter to the world around her. Asterisk,